Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Kelsey Lefebvre, and welcome to the 2026 Oyster Industry Outlook webinar. Before we get started, I'd like to offer a few technology tips to keep in mind while you're viewing today's webinar. First, all attendees are muted throughout the presentation. Once in a while, it's a good idea to tap your mouse so your screen does not go to sleep during the presentation. There will be time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation. Questions can be submitted at any point during the presentation using the question mark button on the right side of your screen. This will expand a text box where you can then type in your question. Lastly, a recording of today's webinar and presentation materials will be available at farmcrediteast.com as well as on our YouTube channel. And then a quick disclaimer, this information is presented in good faith and is not intended for investment, tax, or legal advice. I will now hand it over to my colleague Justin to introduce our speaker today.
Good afternoon, Justin Mortensen. I'm agribusiness loan officer here at Farm Credit East. I'm based in Middleborough, Massachusetts, so deal with a lot of the southeastern Mass and through Connecticut, Rhode Island, and also Long Island. So very familiar with the aquaculture industry. But I wanted to introduce, and we're very grateful to have Bob Rheault here with us today to discuss the aquaculture industry. He started Moonstone Oysters in Narragansett, Rhode Island back in 1986. He has a PhD in biological oceanography and is an adjunct professor at the Department of Fisheries, Aquaculture, and Veterinary Science at URI. He has served as the East Coast Shellfish president for 5 years before he sold his farm and took over the executive director position in 2008. Bob is very passionate in the industry. He's a huge advocate and carries the message with sustainable seafood and economic development to our elected representatives and agency leaders in DC. His research interests include documenting and assigning value to environmental services provided by shellfish aquaculture and overall just benefiting the industry. And he holds a design patent for novel floating upweller design and is a recipient of the National Shell Fisheries Association's Wallace Award. And with that, I will open it up for Bob for the aquaculture industry update.
Thank you, Justin. Are you able to see my screen, or is that working properly?
Yes. We can see your PowerPoint. You just have to put in presentation mode.
Okay. How's that?
Yep, looks good.
So lots of times people ask me, how did you get into this crazy business? And when I was a kid growing up on Cape Cod, I was digging clams for my movie money and watching Jacques Cousteau on TV talk about the Blue Revolution. And I thought there had to be a better way. And he was telling us to farm the ocean. And at the time, at the ripe old age of 13, I told my parents I wanted to grow up to be a shellfish farmer. And they all laughed, which made me want to do it even more. So being a stubborn little kid, I made it my career to try and figure out how to do this. And at the time, it was pretty tricky. We really hadn't figured out how to do it. This is a very young industry. If you go back over the years, we look at wild harvest of oysters and certainly going back 100 years, we find that wild fisheries don't tend to be very sustainable. Shellfish don't run away very well, and we're very efficient at harvesting them. So we've seen wild shell fisheries in decline for decades. And over the years, we slowly learned how to do rudimentary fisheries enhancement, and then it evolved into aquaculture, particularly in Connecticut. They started to grant leases, and you can see all these gray squares along the coastline. This is 1889 oyster grounds, and we had evolved from sailing ships into more steam vessels. and there was a very healthy fleet of these dredge boats operating along the coasts. And we had learned that oyster larvae, so each adult oyster female can produce 30 to 60 million eggs. And those eggs swim around for 2 to 3 weeks in the water column. And then the larvae, little dust specks, about a quarter of a millimeter in size, look around, and they like to set in the mouths of rivers where the salinities are low, because crabs and starfish don't like low salinity waters. And they smell around for a piece of shell, which is probably where an adult oyster once lived, and they try and cement themselves in those areas. And we learned that we could put shell in these river mouths, and the larvae would set on them. And then we could harvest the spatted shell and move it out onto the leased grounds in Connecticut and later in Rhode Island. It was a thriving industry for years. So the national landings of oysters, going back into the 1800s, we peaked with the evolution of the steam engine, honestly, at about 27 million bushels nationally. And then by 1920, landings had declined. And a number of reasons for that. Overharvest, dredging had knocked down a lot of the reefs in the Chesapeake where the oysters were thriving. We had deforested a lot of our land, and silt was burying the natural reefs. And at the turn of the 20th century, oysters were hugely readily available, and they were the poor man's protein. New Yorkers consumed 50,000 bushels a year, an average of 660 per capita, which is about what I like to do. Then we had the invention of the flush toilet and the discovery of germ theory. I mean, they were holding oysters in the East River of Manhattan until they realized that the reason people were getting sick off these oysters was because of germs. They thought that it was miasma or bad air that was making people sick. But it was actually typhoid fever and norovirus that was causing people to die. And once we realized that, demand collapsed and prices declined, and the seeding and the shelling of most of the rivers in Connecticut ceased, and a lot of the leases went into decline. We started to have public health, safety, and control measures. And we eventually figured out wastewater treatment after we invented the flush toilet. That took a while. Harvest area testing became routine, and the great environmentalist Richard Nixon passed the Clean Water Act. And then we now have the National Shellfish Sanitation Program, the NSSP, which is 570-page regulatory manual that describes everything from water quality sampling, tagging, trucking. All of the regulations are quite substantial and nationally required. One thing I'd like to point out is that you'll often hear press accounts of closures and recalls, and that indicates that our program is working. The shellfish on the market are safe. That rarely is put out there by the press, which only really recognizes that if it bleeds, it leads. So they only talk about people that get sick and the closures and recalls that occur. And so this challenging history that we have from over 100 years ago, when people were dying from eating oysters, it remains an issue, and we are often the butt of late night shows on TV. But I maintain that we now have the return to the inflation adjusted price of what it was before people recognized that oysters were causing disease. So we did in the 50s develop hatchery techniques. We learned to grow algae so we could feed the oysters. We learned how to spawn them. And you see this microscopic picture of the little larval oysters swimming around on the top right there. And I was taught by a guy on Fisher's Island who had a hatchery that was quite rudimentary. It had no electricity. And I later built one in 1986 at URI, which is why it took me 10 years to complete my PhD, because I started an oyster business. On the left, you see a batch of larvae that's about the size of a golf ball, and it's well over 1 million baby oysters. And on the right, those are some of the baby oysters that are a few weeks old. They grow about a millimeter a week when things are going well. We've learned to grow them in upwellers. The water flows up, if you look on the right, up through a screen, which holds let's see if you can see that pointer. There's a screen here that holds a bed of baby oysters, and we pump water through them, and it flows out through here. And similarly, there's land-based ones, there's water-based ones, and by pumping a huge amount of water, we can get tremendous growth of the juvenile shellfish. These are ones that are in small hatcheries, very young shellfish. And this is a picture of one of my upwellers, a floating upweller design that's been adopted up and down the coast by a number of small growers. Allows us to grow oysters tremendously efficiently, and basically shaved a year off my production cycle. So there's a lot of work involved in growing oysters. A lot of people think you just put the oysters in the water and cash the paychecks. I wish that were true, but we spend a lot of time sorting and grading. In about 6 weeks, oysters will grow from about 1 millimeter. A million 1 millimeter oysters is a quart, and then in about 6 weeks, it fills 60 of these black fish totes that you see on the right when they're about 15 millimeters. Lots of sieving, because if you leave them all together, the fast growing ones get all the food and the runts never grow at all. So we have a lot of grow out options once you get the seed up to the size where they can grow in a cage. You can do it land-based, intertidal, subtidal in a cage, floating, suspended in the water, or on bottom cages. You can't really afford to do land-based because you can never really afford to pump enough water. They're voracious feeders of the microscopic plants in the water column. Most rudimentary and the least expensive is to put the animals on the bottom, but typically you suffer lots of predation mortality, depending on whether you've got crabs and starfish in your water body, or worse. Down south, they've got herds of these cow nose rays, which can be seen from space, and they love to chow down on shellfish. We in the Long Island Sound and the Connecticut industry, a lot of us use a bottom dredge. We've evolved into, it was really nice when I started out, we would paint chicken wire to get 2 years out of it before it rusted out, and then they invented vinyl coated wire in the late 80s. It was masterful. It was wonderful. Now we could protect our crops from all of the things that like to eat them. And then they had other plastic devices like the polyethylene mesh bags, which we could hold the oysters in and keep the crabs out. This is perhaps the most common method of growing shellfish globally, rack and bag. This is my farm. We used bottom cages, these little oyster condos with bags on shelves. Some growers use floating suspended gear. This is in Narragansett Bay. And what we spend most of our time doing is fouling control. I always said I was a wet nurse to millions of oysters. And the gear gets coated with seaweed and sea squirts that you see on the right, these tunicates, which we actually evolved from, but they coat your gear and they prevent the water from flowing to the animals, which is, it cuts down the flow, and the flow is critical to bring more food to the animals inside the bag or inside the cage. So we have to keep that fouling off, and there's a couple of ways we can do that. Right after I sold my farm, they invented this really nifty tool called the Oyster Grow system, which involves a cage that you can flip up and dry the gear and the oysters in the sun for a day, and then flip it back off and flip it back down into the growing position with the oysters submerged, and all of the dead fouling and sea squirts and algae that's been roasted in the sun gets nibbled away by the fish and the crabs. And it turns out to be a very efficient way to keep your oysters nice and clean and your cages from getting overly fouled. And we'll see if this works. Usually it's the best way to crash a PowerPoint. But so this is a recent invention called the Flip Farm. Excuse me. And it allows us to flip the cage So the oysters in the cage are up in the sun and get roasted on a daily basis. Well, we do this maybe once a month or once a week, depending on how bad the growth is. And you can see that farm, it's about 3 acres. Very efficient method of growing oysters. So once we harvest from these bags or cages or the various different designs of gear that have been invented recently, we have to sort them. And it's all the oysters, they're sort of like snowflakes. Every oyster is a little different. And so we sort them into different size grades, put the ones that aren't big enough or perfectly shaped for the raw bar, put them back in the water to grow a little more, take the ones that are different sizes. Typically, a farm will sell large oysters and small oysters, and some of us are able to afford these tumblers. So you dump out your stuff into a grater, it goes through this tumbler and gets sorted into various sizes, and you put the small ones back to grow some more, and you take the biggest ones that are ready to market. And if you're a really big farm, you can afford to buy these multi-million-dollar vision sorters to do the laborious work of sorting and counting. We'll see if we can make this work. It's usually, as I say, the best way to crash a system. But they've got these multi-million-dollar sorters that they wash the oysters with scrubbers, and then they pass them through a computer, and the vision computer will size and measure the oysters, and then sort them by size and shape and put them in and count them out nicely. I cannot tell you how many millions of times I had to count to 100 selling 100 count bags of oysters to the restaurants that I work with. And you can see the sorter picks out the oysters and shoves them into the various different containers based on their size and shape. And pretty cool. Let's see if I can get back to my presentation here. Uh-oh. What did I do?
We can still see your presentation, Bob.
Oh, good. Because I can't. There we go. Thank you for that. So market development. So where are we in the market, and how have things evolved? Well, through my career on the water, I always like to say it was all roses and unicorns. Everything was great. Once we had developed hatcheries in the industry, it allowed us to develop uniform size seed. We present the larval oysters with a very fine crushed shell, sometimes eggshell, but usually oyster shell. And the little larvae, which are, again, they're a quarter of the size of a millimeter, they perceive that tiny little chip of shell to be as big as a planet. And if there's already an oyster that's cemented to it, they move on and find another one. And that way we get nice single oysters. If you take a big piece of shell and you put it out and multiple larvae set on it, you get clusters of oysters, which are not necessarily what the yuppie raw bars are seeking. They want perfectly shaped singles. And that is something we've been able to achieve by presenting the larvae with a very fine, highly sorted shell chips. And it allowed us to do a sustainable year-round supply. Most states have a wild harvest restriction that don't allow you to harvest in the summer when the oysters are spawning. And so that really made it hard to be a raw bar if you didn't have anything to sell during the summer months. We are able to use something called triploidy, which, so if you remember back in your basic biology, every cell typically has 2 sets of chromosomes, and we can manipulate the first polar body division of the gamete right after fertilization, so that we've got tetraploid. That means 4 sets. And if you spawn a tetraploid with a diploid, oyster, that leaves you with a triploid, and a triploid is sterile, sort of like a seedless watermelon or typically limes. So that allows us to sell a nice, fat, plump oyster in summer. If you're working with a typical oyster, once it spawns in summer, usually around July 4th, a third of its biomass goes away in eggs and sperm, and that is not a desirable product. It tends to be very watery. We always joke you can read a newspaper through it. It's not something you can sell. Nobody wants to eat it. And so you have to wait for a few weeks for the oysters to fatten back up and start growing again. But with triploid oysters, we can have a nice fat oyster year round. And the hatcheries also allowed us to selectively breed for growth and disease resistance, which is magnificent. If you look at what happened in the 50s, the Chesapeake Bay and the mid-Atlantic population of oysters was absolutely decimated in the 30s by MSX, mononucleate spheroid unknown. Turns out it was a protozoan parasite that killed the oyster, and it was devastating. And that parasite has worked its way up the coast. It devastated populations in Cape Cod about 15 years ago, up in Maine, and has now made its way all the way up to Canada with warming waters. We subsequently were able to breed through about 20 years of work or more, a disease-resistant line of animals, so that instead of losing 80 to 90% of your crop, we actually get maybe 90% survival in the face of endemic disease, which is fantastic. Now, we have other diseases we're working on. Unfortunately, I've got a breeding program through the USDA ARS to try and develop oysters that are resistant to the other parasites that also afflict our oysters. And when I started out, it was really fantastic because we were able to go to the restaurants and say, look, I can provide you with a nice uniform, beautiful shaped oyster year round. And they were like, what? Wow, this is fantastic. And suddenly we saw a huge proliferation of oyster bars up and down the coast. And in the mid 90s, I remember looking at Zagat's, and there were over 900 raw bars in Manhattan alone. And this proliferation of raw bars was created a huge demand for our product. And every year we were able to increase production and increase our prices. And it was all roses and unicorns. It was really wonderful. And by the year 2000, we had hundreds of farms marketing trademarked oysters, just like fine wines, each celebrating the regional flavor qualities and differences. It allowed us to really develop a high quality product and a consistent product. And it was interesting over this time period, when I started out, if I tried to sell an oyster that was less than 4 or 5 inches, they would have laughed me out of the marketplace. Today, I remember going in about 20 years ago to the Grand Central Station Raw Bar and hearing a well-dressed woman step up and say, what's the smallest oyster you have? And I almost fell out of my chair. But today the market prefers a 3 to 3.5 inch oyster, which is great for the farmer because we can get that done in maybe 16 months instead of 3 years. And oysters typically have a pretty high mortality rate in culture. Typically, I was always happy if I got 40% mortality over the life cycle. Now with the floating gear, it turns out growers are seeing mortality rates of 20 and 10%, which is magnificent. I would probably still be growing oysters if I ever had that great a survival rate. But the customer preference is now for a 3 and a 3.5 inch oyster. There's still old guys like me who want to get their money's worth and prefer a larger oyster, or if you want to do a cooked oyster, or the Asian market prefers a larger oyster. So there is a market for larger oysters for sure. If you look at regional production, this is the New England production. I was just hired by NOAA to do an assessment of the markets nationwide. And you can see The Connecticut is there in green. Their production fluctuates quite widely because they are still reliant on the natural set of oysters in the mouths of the rivers that they then take out and place on the leases for grow out. So their production varies quite widely from year to year. They started putting shell back out in the rivers. I believe it was around the 90s, and it rejuvenated the industry and brought back quite an amazing industry now in Connecticut, relying on bottom planting without gear and relying mostly on the wild sets in the rivers. It's a little bit sporadic. The other states are almost all growing hatchery reared oysters in containers, as I've been describing. And you can see Massachusetts is now the leader in New England, producing about $30 million worth of oysters. And you can see the impact of the COVID outbreak in 2020 when we shut down all of the restaurants for about 3 or 4 months. We knew that most oysters were being eaten in restaurants, but we didn't really realize it was 90 to 95%. Apparently everybody's afraid to grab a shucking knife and open their own oysters. One thing you do notice is that production has sort of leveled off, and that's disturbing. There's a number of causes for that. If you look around the East Coast, we've got about 2,300 farms growing shellfish from Maine to Florida, and 195 million farm gate. About 60% of that is now oysters. Clam production has leveled off, and it appears that clam demand has declined a little bit recently. Oyster production has been going up steadily, but it appears again to have leveled off recently, especially in the lower New England states. Maine was actually the almost the only state that has been seeing continued growth in production on the East Coast. So what's going on and why are the markets soft? Well, what we've seen over the last 7 years or so is that the farm gate prices for growers has flattened out quite a bit, and it's been quite disturbing to see. So despite the inflation that we're seeing, our ability to raise our prices as farmers has not been there. In fact, we're seeing in many cases downward pressure on prices, which is disturbing, but something that you see probably with a lot of what we call farming commodities, right? As you get more and more growers producing product and they bump into each other in the marketplace, they start to have downward price pressure. Excuse me, I've been battling this cold for way too long. And so in the states where we've exceeded local demand, we are to some measure able to keep prices up by expanding our markets out to the west. When all the kids who worked for me started their own farms in Rhode Island and started coming in at a nickel under me, I created a marketing cooperative and said, look, I will take the 6 biggest growers and I'll get all your product out of state, and we'll leave the local markets to the small growers who are just getting established. And so we were able to keep our prices up by shipping it out to New York and DC and Chicago and Miami and everywhere across the country. And now that co-op is taking the product to 14 different growers to try and keep it out of state and keep the prices up. But in those states where you see local production exceeding demand and the dealers have not been effective in developing markets across the country, there is downward price pressure. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Meanwhile, our input costs have soared, and I'm sure that most farmers have seen this in their work as well. We see that labor costs have soared. These inflation has really hit us hard when the war in Ukraine hit. Steel prices soared. And now we've got tariffs inflating steel. So our cage wire costs are up by over 50%. Shipping costs have tripled since I was in the business. And inflation has caused restaurant prices to soar. So what we're seeing is that fine dining establishments are now often charging, $4 to $6 a piece. Well, it's not so often that people are going to order a dozen oysters when they're that expensive. So we're also seeing, and the National Restaurant Association just came out with their annual report. I think it was yesterday. I saw the statistics, and it was something that we picked up really for the last couple of years, is that as inflation is hitting your disposable income for your consumers and your customers, we're seeing declines in fine dining. People are moving more to fast casual and takeout, and what we're hearing is that people are ordering from the middle of the menu. They're no longer ordering appetizers, desserts, and expensive items, fine bottles of wine, and it turns out that the NRA, the National Restaurant Association, is reporting that there's been a huge hit in terms of profitability at the restaurants because their costs have skyrocketed, and their customer base is pulling back on what they're willing to take, and I think that's all been exacerbated by these new drugs that people are taking to cut back on their weight. Another factor that is influenced is the rise of imports. You look at the pink line, that's Canada. Canada tripled their exports to the U.S. Really since COVID. Mexico has been mostly selling to the West Coast, a West Coast oyster, and South Korea is selling mostly a shucked product, a smoked meat, or a tinned product into the shucked meat market. So it's not really competing directly with what we have. But the Canadian products, especially from PEI, has been hitting us very hard. I mean, $60 million, it's right up there, with what we're producing in New England. It's competing directly in the marketplace with us in New England at a lower price point because they've got tremendous economies of scale. They can get larger farms, that they can afford those optical sorters, which cuts down on their labor costs and their production costs. So as I mentioned, the economies of scale, and this is true for most farming, and indeed a lot of industries see this. But if you're producing more than $2 to $3 million a year, your per oyster production cost is down typically around 40 cents a piece. Whereas smaller farms, it may be only producing a few 100,000. And this is actually the majority of the farms in New England. Your break-even price is probably 60, 70% or more per oyster. So that's a dramatic difference. And we're seeing, low-cost oysters coming down from Canada, the larger farms in Virginia coming out at 40 and 50 cents, competing with a 60, 70, 80-cent farm gate price in New England. And it's really hurting our ability to increase prices and increase production. And in New England, most of us are facing a restriction in our ability to increase the size. Many states like Massachusetts is interesting because they have town rule. So most of the towns there are restricting leaseholders to 1, 2, 3 acre leases, which means that most of those growers are part-timers, producing with 1 or 2 employees maybe, or maybe it's just a mom and pop operation. It's really hard for them to make a living at that scale. And we're going to see as we see downward price pressure and increasing input costs, we will probably see tremendous pressure to consolidate and create larger farms so that we can achieve these economies of scale that allow us to cut down on our production costs. In New England particularly, we've got a very crowded water, a lot of pleasure boaters, water skiers, sailors, recreational fishermen that are pushing back on aquaculture, and they make it really hard to get a new lease to expand, especially with floating gear. They don't like to look at us. They don't like to see the gear. They don't like to have to sail around us. They want to be able to water ski and sail everywhere. So we face a lot of resistance when it comes to getting leases in most of our New England waters. I've always maintained that we should be trying to make the case that we should be devoting a few percentage of our waters to sustainable food production, but the waterfront homeowners tend to believe that they own the water and they don't want to look at us, and they often sue us to prevent farms in front of their viewscape. Excuse me. So we have a very high value per acre production, not quite as high as, say, marijuana, but it's $20,000 an acre on average. We have a great story to tell in that we have the most sustainable marine protein. We don't use any fertilizers or feeds. These shellfish feed themselves off the naturally available plankton. We replant our seed every year to ensure a sustainable harvest. We don't have to worry about over-harvesting like the wild fishery. We don't use any chemicals, drugs, or herbicides, antibiotics. And we have probably the lowest greenhouse gas emissions per pound of protein. At the same time, it's not a job that everybody wants to do. It's very, our labor costs are high because it's hard, smelly, muddy, cold, wet, and dirty work. And you can't find good help that's going to want to do that for chump change. We have a very low profit margin because of our high input costs, boats and moorings and insurance and all that stuff. It costs a lot. We have a very high regulatory burden, an average of $30,000 a year. A recent report came out of regulatory costs per farm. And we also have great stories to tell because not only is it a sustainable product, but these organisms actually benefit the environment in many ways. Because they're filter feeders, they're removing a lot of nitrogen, excess nitrogen from the water. This improves water quality and clarity and allows eelgrass to thrive. And what we found, and I really didn't expect this, but when I was diving on my lease, I noticed that there were thousands of little juvenile fish darting in and out of our cage. And we were able to document that our cages improve abundance and biodiversity. In our federal law, eelgrass is protected under federal law because it's essential fish habitat for juvenile fish and for things like bay scallops that like to set there. We compared the abundance and biodiversity of critters on our aquaculture gear with the nearby eelgrass bed. Honestly, we blew it out of the water. We've got far more abundance and biodiversity. And so if eelgrass is protected by federal law, we should be getting the gold star. We stabilize the benthos, we slow erosion, and we provide jobs and economic development. We've got thousands of jobs in rural coastal communities that really identify, in many cases, with the local food production. And they will typically say that our oysters taste best, and I love that. We support a lot of other downstream businesses. While fisheries have been in decline, the trucks that run up and down the coast and the companies that repair boats and sell boats, they're now selling to shellfish farmers. And we also support equipment manufacturers. So we are employing a lot of people in the community. And you don't have to listen to me. I'm actually I'm obviously an industry hack. You can't trust me, but we've got the Nature Conservancy coming out, and they're saying that we provide all these services. They've got a document online called Restorative Aquaculture, and they talk about how each hectare or 2 acres of shellfish farming is removing half a ton of nitrogen, which has a value of $50,000 if you were to estimate the cost of doing that through improved wastewater treatment. We increase the abundance of wild fish harvested by commercial fisheries by up to 5 tons per year. And we're filtering huge amounts of water um, because these animals are feeding off of the plankton and pulling that nitrogen out of the system and putting it in a box and shipping it off to New York where they can put it in their septic system. So in the course of finding and interviewing lots of experts around the country about what we're finding in the marketplace, we came up with a few recommendations. Try to avoid local competition, which depresses prices. Develop markets in the heartland cities. One thing that we know for a fact is that if you interview people who live within 100 miles of the coast, and you ask them what percentage of people have tried a delicious, fresh New England raw oyster, it's actually a pretty high percentage of the population. But if you get more than 100 miles from the coastline, that percentage drops dramatically. So I see that as a screaming market opportunity. We need to cut our production costs through automation and efficiency. And we need to do a better job of marketing. We need to target younger consumers, emphasizing the features that younger consumers want. They want sustainability, they want nutritional value, they want to celebrate and have a good time. And these are all features of oysters. And so we can push that. I think we need to get out and start handing, at every tailgate party, at every college football game in the country, we need to be handing out raw oysters and get some of these young kids hooked on what is really a wonderful product in so many ways. And we need to develop value-added products that people can eat at home, toss it on the grill or in the microwave and have a topped oyster with Rockefeller that they can just buy at the local grocery store or fish market that's frozen and it has a good shelf life. Unfortunately, we're going to be seeing the consolidation of farms, and I think we need, from a regulatory standpoint, to convince our managers that giving people a 3-acre farm is committing them to a lifetime of backbreaking labor without the hope of profitability or a retirement plan. And we need to be looking at ways to give people larger farms so that they can achieve profitability and have a sustainable business as well as a sustainable product. Cooperative marketing is something that I've been an advocate for, but it's not easy. It turns out that shellfish farmers are kind of like fishermen. They don't get along well and they don't like to cooperate. So most cooperatives fail, but there are ways to do it. If I can do it, it's not impossible. Here's an example of a nice vacuum packed frozen top off oyster product. It's being produced down in North Carolina. I think that would be something that we should be seeing more of. And of course, this is my beautiful oyster, and I think that people need to be seeing more of that at home. I wish that people would learn how to shuck at home, because you can certainly buy cheap oysters from your local oyster farm and enjoy them at home for a lot less than you can at the restaurant. So I encourage you to check out our website, ecsga.org. There's a vast amount of information there. We've got training programs, marketing tips, public health and food safety information, information about the ecological benefits, our newsletter archives, grower resources, and much, much more. And hopefully somebody's got a question. Let me see, how did I do? Did I get the time right?
I think you did, Bob. We have got about like 16 minutes left. There are a few questions. I'm going to actually start with the first one, Bob. Before we started, you were talking about the research that you're doing with breeding at URI. Do you want to explain to everybody kind of what you're working on and what you're looking to accomplish with that?
Yeah, so through the development of hatcheries, as I mentioned, we are able to develop through selective breeding animals that are resistant to some of the diseases that we have. And it took 20 generations or more down in the mid-Atlantic for us to develop animals that were resistant to MSX. But we have other parasites that we're also concerned about. And we also, this is an animal, a species that grows from Atlantic Canada all the way down to Brazil. Those are, it's the same species, but there's still substantial differences in the animals that grow in high salinity waters, low salinity waters, and cold waters and warm waters. You try and take an oyster from, say, the Gulf of Mexico and grow it in Maine, forget it. It's not going to work out very well, even though it's the same species. So we have regional differences, and we need to have animals that are adapted to our local environments that are also resistant to disease. So the goal was to get some of these really smart geneticists to take advantage of the new tools that are available. And, you know, we used to use what's called shotgun breeding, and that would be you'd spawn a bunch of animals and see who survived. And you weren't really sure if that animal survived because it got lucky or because it had the right genes. So now, once we've sequenced the genome, there's an incredible amount of variability in the oyster genome. And once we start to identify which genes are associated with the various traits that we desire, we can select those animals specifically and breed them. So we've got some very smart people working here at URI, breeding animals at the Milford Lab in Connecticut with the NOAA lab there. And we can select for the various traits. Of course, we want fast growth. We want survival in the face of disease. We want to be able to grow these animals in Maine and in up and down the coast, wherever we're growing oysters. And so we've got these new tools that allow targeted gene-assisted selection breeding. And the plan is to grow 100 lines of animals, individual pairings, and grow them out in different states and see how they perform in the different areas in the face of disease. Unfortunately, when Doge hit this past year, the team of 5 geneticists was reduced to 3, and we're faced with a hiring freeze. So I need to build the team back up and reestablish the contracts for the grow out, and hopefully we'll get this back on track if I can get permission to get around the hiring freeze, the federal hiring freeze that has really set my program back by at least 2 years. So that's I'm a federal lobbyist. I go to DC. We'll be heading there in April, and we'll be pushing for that. I think it's there's also other factors that we're pushing for, like a lot of farmers. We would love to have access to H-2B workers and things like that. We would love to see an end to some of this. The tariff inputs, aluminum and steel cost, it's killing us. So we'll be pushing for some of our priorities that are influencing our cost of production and making it hard to make a living, just like all the other producers of other farm products do.
We have another question. So the CDC public advisory issued on December 23rd.
Ah, yes.
So that obviously wasn't very good for the industry, and especially how they handled it, right, Bob? I think it was a little questionable on the traceability and all that stuff. I guess maybe describe what the industry is doing to combat that.
Oh, yeah. So I was on vacation, and I had promised my wife I wasn't going to open the laptop when I did get a call, and somebody said in 2 days the CDC is going to come out with this announcement. And it turns out that there's this very obscure, rare strain of salmonella that's associated with bearded dragon lizards and tropical tortoises. And somehow 67, 69 people had gotten ill. And a number of those people, I think 18 of them, had said that they had eaten oysters. Well, the CDC says that, that incredibly high percentage of people having eaten oysters, that's definitive proof of the oysters being the causative agent. Well, that's, not typically, as a scientist, I don't believe that anybody believes that correlation is proof of causation. And through the ISSC, the National Shellfish Sanitation Program, we have a definition of an outbreak that you have to have 2 unrelated people, because if they were related, they might have given each other the illness. But you have to have 2 unrelated people having eaten shellfish from the same source. And that is not the case in this particular outbreak. We had oysters from 3 Canadian provinces, 9 US states, and Mexico. over a 6-month period implicated in these illnesses from this bizarre, rare strain of salmonella. And as I was telling some of the, I want to have some oversight hearings amongst our congressional colleagues. As I've been telling them, if I was a terrorist, I don't think I could figure out how to do that. It just doesn't make sense. There were no two illnesses from the same harvest area. And that's so it doesn't meet the definition of an outbreak under our definition. And so we have pushed back quite a bit through a number of the oversight. The Senate Oversight Committee is the Health Committee, and the House Oversight Committee is the House Committee on Commerce and Energy, which amazingly has oversight over the FDA and CDC. So we're trying to get the CDC to recognize our definition of an outbreak that we have for shellfish and make sure that they don't screw us like this again. I mean, they caused millions and millions of dollars of lost sales and what we call reputational damage by coming out and insinuating that oysters were the causation of these illnesses, which I really can't believe that they were, because it just doesn't make sense from a scientific standpoint without having a common source. So we've taken some steps to try and get the CDC to fix how they talk about outbreaks. We've taken some steps to make sure that the FDA talks to the states a little better. They weren't sharing information that allow us to do a proper investigation. We are taking some steps to try and improve traceability, because it turns out that some of the inland states where these illnesses occur, the restaurants are not doing a good job of retaining tags, so it's hard to trace back the oysters to the sources. There were a lot of things that were a little hinky about this investigation, to say the least. But like I said, we have a challenging history to overcome. So people are always going to look to the oyster. Oftentimes I'll have people say, I had oysters last night. I got really sick this morning. Well, it's actually pretty rare that you can get sick that fast from a bacterial or viral pathogen. It just doesn't work that way. It's much more likely that it was the raw vegetables that you had 3 days ago that are causing that illness, but they always blame the oyster.
Yeah, that wasn't very good timing.
No, I'm still dealing with it.
Yeah. You mentioned the PEI and the $60 million worth of imports. And there's been an MSX outbreak up in the PEI. I guess what's the outlook for imports in 2026, and how do you think that will affect the pricing for domestic product this year?
Yeah, so we're already seeing the impacts of that right now. The market is on fire because typically the Canadian processors would be shipping down truckloads of oysters from Canada, but they've lost most of their crop, probably 90%, and we're likely to see it's going to take probably at least 3 years for them to recover. We assume that they're going to get their hands on the genes for disease-resistant lines of oysters and introduce them up in Canada. It hasn't happened yet, and they don't have the hatchery capacity that we have down here. But there's a lot of industry pressure to do that, and I suspect that they will be building hatcheries rapidly, and that they will get their hands on the genetic material they need to have disease-resistant animals, like we did years ago when it came and it wiped out. We had growers in Damascotta, Maine, and Duxbury, Mass. Two of our biggest production growing areas got wiped out by MSX, and those growers quickly got religion and they were back in it in a year or two. Well, up there it takes 3 years to get an oyster, so we'll probably see them come screaming back into the market in about 3 years. But yeah, we do expect that we'll have a nice hiatus and a $60 million hole in the marketplace to fill for at least the next 3 years. And whether that allows us to take advantage of higher prices remains to be seen. Excuse me.
How have farmers, specifically, obviously in Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Connecticut, coped with this year's nor'easters, especially the one we got last week?
Yeah, it's been brutal. I remember 40 years ago, I was harvesting oysters through 7 inches of ice, and that was brutal on the body, on the boats, on everything, and it was quite challenging. But with warming, we haven't seen that kind of ice in years. Well, we certainly saw it this year. Excuse me. Someday this cold is going to finally go away. So, yeah, it's been a huge challenge. I got a lot of growers who are, I've got pictures of people going out with snowmobiles and chainsaws to get the oysters out of the water. It's been a real challenge for growers all the way down. Ice was even forming down in North Carolina. So if you've got access to oysters right now, your market is it's going great. There's a huge hole in the market, as I said, because Canada's not shipping, and a lot of our growers can't get out there. A lot of our marinas are iced in. I remember, we would spend all day busting a path out to the lease, and have to do it again the next day, just to keep oysters on the marketplace. It's brutal. It's tough on the body. It's tough on the outboards. It's tough on the boats. But yeah, nobody. If it was easy, everybody would be doing it, right?
You got it, Bob. That is all the questions we have. I'll let Kelsey kind of wrap this thing up, Bob, and we appreciate you doing this and being on this webinar.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. Just one last reminder, the recording for this webinar, along with Bob's article, he also wrote us a 2026 Outlook article. All of that is available on our website at farmcrediteast.com. I think that wraps us up. Thank you again, Bob, and thank you, Justin.